Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Our next panel promises to be a healthy debate on intricate geopolitical landscape, especially in the US-China power struggle. UN Trade and Development reports that in 2022, global trade hits a record of USD 32 trillion, but rising protectionism could disrupt future growth. China plus one appear to benefit Malaysia, but US is not standing by idle without courting Southeast Asian nation. It is a case of Madu and Racun, where the superpowers caught smaller nation, but there's no free lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, leading the discussion is Professor Dr. Evelyn Devadesan, a professor at the Faculty of Business and Economics, University Malaya, and an expert in international trade and regional integration. Let's welcome her on stage. Dr. Evelyn. Let's give Dr. Evelyn a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And our distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we have Dr. Ho Yi-Sun, is the Principal Advisor to the Pacific Research Center of Malaysia and a Senior Fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Ho is a distinguished political analyst focusing on Southeast Asian political economy and international relations, particularly involve China and the US. Our next panelist extend his apology. That will be Mr. David Wallace, the Acting High Commissioner of British High Commission in Malaysia. He's unable to join us here today because he's a bit under the weather. Joining in his place will be Mr. Woon Kai Jeng, RAM Senior Economist and Head of Economic Research. Let's welcome Mr. Woon. And we also have Professor Renato Lima de Oliveira as an Associate Professor of Business and Society at the Asia School of Business, Kuala Lumpur, and research affiliated to MIT. His research focuses on the political economy of development, state-business relations, energy transition, and industrial policy. If you're ready, from Dr. Evelyn, the floor is yours. Take it away, ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Rating Agency Malaysia for this kind invitation to moderate this session and share the platform with three experts here. This session is called Geopolitics, Madu dan Racun, and I was just informed by Miss Julie Ng, Madu and Racun means the underlying agenda. So while in the morning we talked a lot of hype about investments coming in, hopefully in this session we'll able to nail what could be the uncertainties and also the hidden agenda for some of these geopolitical shifts. To me, geopolitics in itself has multiple interpretations, but without going into that, one has to look at it's an exciting time because there are prolonged shifts in geopolitics. We don't see it coming to an end, and one has to recalibrate what are the economic considerations in shaping trade and investment. If we look back many decades ago, we would talk about geographical distance being a barrier to trade and investment. Yeah? And over time, with service links and improvements in technology, people talked about the depth of distance, geographical distance per se. Then comes cultural distance, yeah, with the emergence of China and Asia, because at the end of the day, it's not countries that trade, that businesses trade, and culture, common language, Mandarin, becomes very important, and therefore you see China engaging a lot with Malaysia businesses and also Singaporean businesses. Thereafter, we see regulatory distance coming on board because we see the rise of border restrictions and behind the border. And these restrictions are not just non-tariff measures, they are service restrictions, services trade restrictions, and today in the form of data flow, data storage restrictions, because trade is not just about physical goods and services, it's about data flows that have grown exponentially. And finally, today we talk about geopolitical distance. And to me as a trade person, I was thinking geopolitical distance, how do you measure it? And it was only timely that McKinsey Global Institute developed measure of geopolitical distance. And what was very telling in that data is that ASEAN's geopolitical distance for the period 2017 to 2023 has remained stable, meaning that ASEAN is still maintaining its non-aligned position. I wouldn't like to call it neutral position. That gives a very wrong connotation. When you say you're neutral, like you don't take a position, I would say multi-alignment position, yeah, or mid-alignment, like how McKinsey calls it. So looking at how we have moved from geographical to geopolitical distance, is it really different? It's just an analog. It's like you are returning to the circle to look at how geographic influences power relationships and subsequently how that affects trade and investment. Just to set the context for today's session, which is on geopolitics, before we unpack Madu and Racun in terms of investments and industrial policy, can I get a quick take on this question? Has geopolitical rivalry and the race for technological supremacy, especially this race for critical minerals, the race to, or the war in terms of chips, profoundly rewired regional value chains? I think there's a lot of hype about regional value chains, I mean, shifting towards Asia, and we are benefiting from it. But the reality is pivoting supply chains back home is not an easy task. And at the same time, one would notice that the shifting of supply chains cannot be overly generalized. So can I get a quick take of 3 minutes before we get into the crux of the discussion, starting from Dr. O, please?
Thank you very much. I agree with you very much about there's a lot of hype about the upgrading of value chains and so on. I think as most regional countries, with the exception of perhaps Singapore, are still developing the countries, I think we need to look at perhaps what I would call both the upper ends as well as the lower ends of value chain. We cannot just look at all this pursuit of high technology and so on, but in order to benefit perhaps the lower income groups in our various regional countries, as well as those who are, shall we say, less educated and so on. We also need to look at the lower end of value chains, such as traditional agriculture, plantation industry, processing of raw materials, or provision of services by small and medium enterprises and so on, because whether we like it or not, they provide a lot of employment opportunities for most of our citizens in regional countries. And some of these, such as agriculture, they could be upgraded. I mean, they could be upgraded towards the upper end of value chains, such as with the implementations of smart agriculture in order to build up the so-called food resilience in various countries in the region. Malaysia, for example, is importing more than half of its foodstuff, and we are a country with relatively sparse populations, with a lot of very fertile rains and fertile lands and very heavy rainfall sometimes. So that could be done. On the other hand, of course, we welcome all these wonderful high-tech investments from the various superpowers, all the AIs, all the renewable energies, and all these wonderful projects and factories and data centers and so on, because it could hopefully move us out of the middle income trap and usher us into high income status. But so in terms of this upper end of the value chain, I think, well, sometimes we do need to make decisions, because there's a lot of sanctions imposed by the United States and Western countries on all these high-tech products and services out of China, or sanctions against exporting computer chips to China and so on. So effectively, you have to make a choice whether you like it or not, whether you would like to align yourself more with the Western, shall we say, the Western version of supply chain, value chain, or with the more Chinese dominant kind of supply chains. And staying neutral does not mean, like not moving and always stay at the center. I think it would mean, for example, sometimes we align ourselves more with the West, sometimes we align ourselves more with China, as long as it suits our national interests. It's a very pragmatic outlook from me, of course. But if you are talking about the lower end of the value chain, then the choice is actually very simple. It's undoubtedly China, because the US is indulging in another bout of protectionism. The Europeans are very much engrossed in all this environmental protection, labor rights, and so on. And well, China, well, sorry, countries like China, they're buying a lot of raw materials, from minerals, from palm oil, and so on, from countries such as Malaysia and other regional countries. And therefore, the choice is very simple: sell more and do more business with China, because the West, they have all this wonderful, protectionism and all these very specific requirements which we simply, as developing countries, it could be very difficult to subscribe to. So to me, it depends on which end of the value chain you're talking about. Upper end, then sometimes you align with the West, sometimes you align with China as your national interest suits you. Lower end, undoubtedly China. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O. Mr. Woon, on the same question.
Yeah, so I think I agree that definitely the geopolitical rivalry has definitely changed the fabric of how supply chain works. Nowadays, people talk about whether you see a lot of buzzwords like is it nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring of industries back to their own country, or I think nowadays some companies, especially, rather than thinking of where to put it, they think of where to put it where it has the lowest risk of being implicated or affected by all these geopolitical kind of situations. So in terms of, I think if we touch a bit on, say, the benefits or where it is heading, I think countries like Malaysia is actually one of the key beneficiaries. So I think we briefly talked about it last night, whether has anyone actually really counted or computed on whether how much of the impact or how big of the impact is actually attributed to all these geopolitical rivalries. But I think no one can tell for certain, but I think what we can base on or rely on at the moment is just, I think the narrative is there. The words on the ground, the news on the ground are actually pointing towards that. We can see, especially for Malaysia, over the last 2 years, we have actually attracted quite a lot of investments, especially into some of the key notable sectors that are of contention, such as the E&E sector, which Malaysia has a competitive advantage in. Other than that, I think anecdotally, I think yesterday there was also a big news. I think Thailand managed to also managed to move up the value chain. They managed to secure a front-end process fabrication from China. I think from Japan, if I'm not mistaken. So the narrative is that we are seeing a lot more news and a lot more investments flowing into the region as a whole. But I think the key thing, or what made the region so attractive, partly coming back to that whole de-risking discussion. I think Prof also mentioned earlier about how I think the region as a whole is considerably or relatively neutral or non-aligned to any particular major power. We do, I guess, to put it very crudely, we do play both sides very well. We managed to appease both China and US in this case relatively well, but that's why I think we do see quite a fair bit of interest. And I think given the neutrality, I think businesses in general are also quite comfortable to invest most of their money here. Given that investments are generally a long-term play, they will definitely want something or a region that is more stable in that front. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much for the question. Thank you for the invitation to join this forum. I think this is a very timely and important topic. I actually do teach that I teach one course called International Political Economy, International Business at Asia School of Business for MBAs. And I tend to say to my students that this is a course not for managers, but a course for CEOs, a course for business leaders. Because when you have to make a decision about investments over time in over jurisdictions, then you start thinking about what is the risk of expropriation? What is the risk that the new budget is going to completely change a regulation? And if it does, which kind of coalitions can you put together to protect your investments? How lobbying works in practice in different parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. So what is the importance of geopolitics? It's going to vary according to which sector you are. If you are asset specific, or if you are using a kind of technology that is restricted, or you are aiming to export to certain markets, say you are exporting to Europe, you have to take into account evolutions of, say, CBAM or different environmental pressure. This is not a rivalry in itself, but it's one point of how geopolitics is evolving towards shaping your business decisions here in Southeast Asia. Same of being integrated in one particular value chain or not. If you're communications, are you going to be the supplier of Huawei, or are you going to work with Ericsson and so on? So these things matter, and they are increasingly relevant as the world goes into a phase of two key transformations. And happy to talk more about that. But in the next 25, 26 years, we are going to live in a very different world, one which we need to decarbonize. So everything that's related to sustainability and reduction of fossil fuels, this is going to matter a lot. And second, we are going to see AI everywhere. And this is also going to affect the factors of production of countries in Southeast Asia. So taking together these two radical transformations of society as a whole, not driven by China or United States alone, but these are demands of society, decarbonization and AI everywhere. How do we position ourselves as emerging markets, as members of ASEAN and so on? That it will have to be taken way beyond, oh, are you going to align with China? Are you going to align with the United States? No, the challenge is way bigger and existential.
Okay, I think three of you all touched on investments. Dr. O, investments, according to reported data, greenfield investments have increased by 110% into ASEAN, based on pre-COVID averages relative to post-COVID averages. Now, that's a huge percentage, 110%. And they have gone into renewable energy, semiconductor, and critical minerals. My concern is, even in the morning session, we spoke a lot about investments coming in. Yeah, luring investments is one side of the story, but getting those investments to translate in terms of improving our local tech capabilities, that's a structural problem that we have been facing for some time. In fact, we have talked about moving away from quantity-based FDI inflows to quality-based FDI inflows. And today we talk about digital FDI into ICT and also hosting data centers. Now, to what extent in terms, and we are also targeting strategies, we're using FDI targeting strategies. So to what extent have countries in the region able to leverage high-tech investments, not just to grow their trade capabilities, but at the same time to drive digital transformation? Because to me, this kind of over-reliance on FDI may not be sustainable in the long term. That is one. And also, we can think of it is that a lot of, especially in the electronic sector, we are basically contract manufacturers. Now, we have not moved beyond that. So, I mean, are these investments going to be really a plus point? We have not talked about the other side of the coin, which is investments going out, FDI versus DIA, direct investment abroad. Now, that's needed to complete our supply chain rather than just bringing in lots of FDI inflows. What is your take on this? Yeah.
Well, I think the key word, as you mentioned just now, it's really ready or readiness. It's just like I'm from the eastern state of Sabah, and every year we would talk about bringing in more tourists from overseas and so on. But are we really ready for this tourist influx? Whether we have the tourist infrastructures, we have enough parking space for tour buses, for example, enough toilets for the tourists, for example. I think the same thing would apply for example, attracting the high-tech foreign investments, right? By definition, they are high-tech and there's a lot of technology content. So does our education system produce adequate, high-tech personnel, students who are fluent, who are capable in terms of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in order to handle this influx of high-tech investments. A lesser step would be, do we produce enough so-called TVET, technical and vocational education and trainees in order to, again, handle this sort of influx of high-tech investments? Because the competition is very steep. Granted, now there's all this so-called de-risking, China plus one and so on. But China plus one does not equate necessarily to China plus Malaysia, right? It could also equate to China plus Vietnam. And despite this sort of conflict between China and Philippines, it could also mean China plus Philippines, right? So we have very healthy but stiff competition from our regional neighbors in terms of attracting these high-tech investments. And if you look at all these math Olympics scores and so on, typically these neighbors would beat us. Vietnam certainly beat us by I don't know how many miles in terms of their math capabilities of their students and so on. So how are we going to play catch up to that? I think it's also very important. In basic infrastructure is wonderful here in West Malaysia, but in Sabah and Sarawak, well, Sarawak nowadays they are very grand and great and everything, but at least Sabah, we are still lacking in, shall we say, clean water supply, stable electricity supply, without which, how can we compete with Johor in order to attract more data center, right? And if you are talking about outward bound investments, well, in downtown Melbourne, you see those property developments, they are mostly by Malaysian property developers. So we are investing outward, but perhaps not in shall we say, high tech and so on. We are investing in things such as property developments overseas in Australia and so on. So, but I think still, in order to have shall we say, more local oriented high-tech ecosystem, education, the changing of mindset to take risk, and the willingness of, well, there are a lot of financial institutions here, the willingness of financial institutions, of angel investors to invest in all these startups and so on. I think all these are very essential ingredients. Thank you.
Thank you. KJ, can you give Malaysian perspective? How have we fared in terms of investment flows? Where have they gone into and so on here?
Yeah, so I think Malaysia definitely has performed relatively well. So like a bit of continuation of what I mentioned earlier about how I think investment attention has been quite focused on ASEAN over the last few years. And I think Malaysia is one of the key beneficiaries definitely. So if you look at some of the FDI numbers, I think we reached a high of around 75.4 billion in 2022. That's, I think, the highest on record so far. And it remained relatively elevated last year, which totaled around 40.4 in terms of overall investment, foreign direct investments into Malaysia. So 2022 was more of an E&E story because I think there was kind of an undersupply or undercapacity on the global front, which is why I think a lot of people chose to expand their capacity in Malaysia. But last year was more of a data center story. We do see a lot of investments being materialized in terms of data center, and we should expect more to come in, because if you look at, say, the pipeline, if you look at the MIDAS investment approval numbers, it continues to be relatively high. Last year, it reached around 330 billion in terms of total investment approved, with the bulk of it coming from foreign investors at around close to 60%. So, and the bulk of the foreign investments is also mostly into the manufacturing sector, as well as the information and communication, so which a large part can be attributed again back to the data center story, which is why I think there's a lot of hype or a lot of attention being put into data centers recently. I think another high growth sector for Malaysia also, which also received a lot of attention, as mentioned earlier about data centers. I think on a broader perspective, some investment has also flowed into the digital economy, and is one of the main beneficiaries or the main attentions that's being put into Malaysia over the last few years. I think the number for total approved digital investment in Malaysia actually soared to 80 billion in 2022 from just 3.4 billion in 2021, and it continues to be very high at around 60.5 billion in 2023. So definitely the digital investment or the digital economy story is there for Malaysia. But I think, like, in terms of benefits, you mentioned earlier about how the E&E, we have always been stuck on that lower end of the value chain. I think there were some concerns about how data centers, what benefits could it actually materialize or generate to the overall economy. Definitely, I think direct impact or first round impact might not be as nice as what people would want to think of, because I think when we talk about digital economy, we think of more than just data centers. So I think I concur with what Mr. Hindri said earlier about how Malaysia really need the execution, the proper execution, because a large part of the benefits would be from the digitalization of Malaysian economy over the next maybe 10 years or so, coming from all this data center boom in Malaysia. So execution is important. If we do manage to actually execute properly and develop our digital economy to the next level, definitely I think Malaysia would also benefit quite heftily. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Woon, for that Malaysian perspective. Professor.
Can I pick up on one point on
Sure.
that? So, and let me be a bit provocative. So we can celebrate all those investments. They're great, amazing FDI coming to Malaysia. But let me pose a question here. What if some of those investments, a lot, they have distortions because they're following the wrong price signals? What if the attraction of a lot of these data centers are because Malaysia is underpricing resources? Very cheap electricity, very low electricity rates in comparison to the rest of ASEAN, which is going to be a challenge towards decarbonizing the sector. Very low land in comparison, I think it's about 7 to 10 times of cheaper Johor than Singapore. Then also water. So you attract an investment that's going to be in the country for the next 10, 20 years, that's only profitable because it's underpricing resources. To a large extent, also the manufacturing sector. You have, as an economist, you analyze what is the relationship between labor and capital expenditures. A lot of the manufacturing sector of Malaysia runs on foreign guest workers receiving minimum wage. So if you actually remove that from the picture and you only have investments that can pay the jobs at the productivity level that Malaysians will want to work, then the structure of the economy would look very, very different. So how can you actually have upgrade if the jobs that are some of those investments are either being attracted because they are underpricing natural resource, or because they have to rely on extremely low salaries of temporary workers in a world where you actually have to upskill workers, that these repetitive tasks are dying, are going to be consumed. Another example on that makes me raise a question mark on celebrating FDI has been on the steel industry. So Malaysia attracted big investments in the steel industry. With colleagues, we wrote a report about that, of blast furnace coming out of China, and you end up with more capacity. That's fantastic. Just with one huge problem. the amount of carbon emissions that are coming from those investments are going to seriously risk the possibility of the country meeting their national emissions targets, because blast furnace steel production is very carbon intensive. So when you actually take into account the quality of investments in terms of how distorted it might be in terms of resource allocation and ability to generate jobs that will pay high salaries, the picture becomes much more complex. And I think that's what we need to incorporate in discussions about that. Not all FDI is the same. Some will help the country really to go to where it can be. And that requires a more nuanced picture of how the economy is evolving.
Well,
I told you I was going to be provocative.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. The session is Madu and Racun. So thank you for that alternative perspective. Yeah. Professor, on industrial policies, if I can get back to you on this, we heard in the first session, they mentioned industrial policies. Now, when we think of industrial policies in the West, yeah, or even in Asia, China including, the recent data indicates that there's an unprecedented rise of 2,500 measures, yeah, in the form of grants, aids, subsidies, and out of that, 70% is trade distorting. So you may think, I mean, they are invoking national security to implement this industrial policies. You would think that it's for competitive reasons, yeah, when you actually give state aid, but they're not giving the aid because of market failure. They're giving the aid for strategic competition. So the way in which this is evolving, it's resulting in potential spillovers across borders. You may think, how would industrial policies which are dominant in EU, US affect Southeast Asia? Indeed, it would, because if you look at the way those policies are evolving, we would have problems exporting or even importing. That's one. Second, it's also the way the alliances are moving. Biden has proposed, this is just at a proposal stage, to have a Chip 4 alliance, US, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. Now, this will result in a semiconductor supplier network that can be very, I would think, if I'm not being too harsh to say, like a mafia kind of control. Yeah? How would that pan out for people like us, yeah, in Asia? Because we are not only talking about trade alliances that are forming, new trade alliances, we are talking about industry-specific trade alliances, like this Chip 4 alliance, if it comes on board. So can you give, because I know you work on the role of the state, and also, I mean, at the end of the day, industrial policy, we used to think of it traditionally, is bad to some extent, because if you get the policy wrong, you target the wrong industries. And there are also debates at the moment on industrial policy per se, which is spilling over. It may stifle innovation, because what about those which are not subsidized? So you have a debate between corporations that are subsidized vis-a-vis those that are not subsidized. So your take on the spillovers and role of the state, and what you think about its stifling innovation here?
So I think in academia, there is a legitimate debate on what's the role of industrial policy in development. I think trade economists might be completely against it because it's getting the price wrong. Development economists and political economists, and that's my background, we see it as a potential route towards speeding up development. And there is a long history to that, long tradition in Europe, in Latin America, in East Asia. That's where industrial policy came to in the developmental state. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they were used as a model to other countries, where you balance certain priorities, nurturing certain industries that would have potential to gain, and you take a position not of static comparative advantage, but a dynamic one, right? So you invest in sectors that will have potential to really make a change, structural benefits down the road. That's what the world did practice industrial policy. Some of them did very openly, and others criticize it, but they always kept certain degrees of industrial policy. What we are seeing now is to be more vocal and open about it, even in societies that preached free trade, like the United States or like Europe after the formation of the European Union, with different components. So the CHIPS Act, then it's about security, but also on guaranteeing the sustainability of the edge in technology. The IRA or the Green New Deal, it's about decarbonizing society. Also tied to the idea that if the whole world will need those technologies, and if we invest first, then we will have an edge on that. I came to Malaysia to do research, and it was about industrial policy in the energy sector. The Petronas vendor development model, how Petronas was created in 1974 with the PDA, and it already had a license requirement to internalize knowledge and increase the number of firms. So throughout the history, Malaysia has adopted industrial policy in many different areas. Infant industry, Proton was the result of that. A lot of the investment channels, they are related to industrial policy. The issue now is that when all countries are adopting it, trade becomes harder because you cannot fully gain benefits just because as a firm you are really good, but you have to navigate a web of restrictions of different interests and then try to get some niches on that. So to me, there's no surprise that industrial policy is become popular again. It can lead to distortions and bad protectionism. There are examples in Malaysia about that. But it can also lead to really interesting kinds of investments. And I think, and I'm totally not in favor of China's development model, but in the EV sector, it's a very, very clear case of supporting an industry that created national champions, and BYD is one example.
Thank you. Maybe we'll look at, we've spoken a bit of the Madu and Racun part of it. What about going forward, Dr. O? I mean, what we see now is global trade, because of this geopolitics, multilateralism to some extent is not really working. We could even say failing to some extent. So we see minilateral deals coming on board. Singapore has signed, I mean, some of it are formal free trade agreements, some of them are informal. One would like to think these are corner solutions. So do you think, or should governments in the region be doing more mini deals rather than big comprehensive free trade agreements like the ones that we have seen going forward? Yeah.
Well, sometimes I reminisce about the days more than 20 years ago when I was working in the UN system, when I think there was a Thai gentleman and a New Zealand gentleman. They were competing against each other in order to become the Director General of WTO. Because back then in the late 1990s, WTO was a big thing, or the Doha round and so on. And people were talking about going about free trade, worldwide free trade through, well, the World Trade Organization. But somehow the momentum died down, and increasingly countries in the region, because we are one of the major trading regions of the world, countries around the region, they are going either into, as you mentioned, mini-lateralisms, just several countries signing some sort of FTAs, or even bilateral FTAs. I think, again, I think two things. Number one, as your national interest dictates, sometimes you could be engaged in larger type of multilateral free trade agreements, such as the RCEP, such as ASEAN Economic Community and various other such free trade plus agreements. I think that's fine. Malaysia, Singapore, and various other countries, ASEAN countries, together with China and New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and Korea, we are into RCEP. So that's nice. But sometimes, individual countries, they might also enter into bilateral agreements if you find that you need some sort of free trade arrangements as your trade volume increases, right? Just between the two countries. So I think both are equally legitimate. But what I think the most important thing is actually to have the national implementations of all these multilateral, minilateral, or bilateral free trade agreements. For example, ASEAN countries, we are technically all in this wonderful ASEAN economic community, similar to last time European economic communities, right? We should have free trade across ASEAN countries. I can have the factories in Indonesia, and the goods or intermediary products into Malaysia should be tariff-free and so on. But I don't see that. Also, similarly with RCEP, we should have the world's largest free trade agreements comparable to the European Union and so on. But even exporting frozen durian to China, we are facing a lot of non-tariff barriers. And it's a big hoo-ha. Finally, we can export frozen durian to China. I mean, we are both RCEP member states. I would think we should have no problem importing or exporting all these durians and other wonderful fruits, right? But still, we are faced with many countries. I mean, how many of us in Malaysia truly make use of the ASEAN Economic Community or RCEP in order to invest in our neighboring countries or to welcome investments from our neighboring countries? Our trade volumes among ASEAN members is only 1/4 of what we trade with the major economic powers. So I think for me, the key thing is actually national implementations to make sure your national legislations in terms of tariffs, in terms of customs and so on, are in line with your free trade commitments internationally. That for me is the number one thing, yeah.
I think that's exactly what we mentioned or talked about earlier, regulatory distance, yeah? Aligning or streamlining non-tariff measures, for example, is key to actually creating trade. So there's a lot of underutilization of a lot of these FTAs, especially when they're less binding. When there's less binding and it's by consensus, it's quite difficult. Can I get to Professor, if you could also talk a little bit on going forward. One of the key things that we think is this non-alignment position. Very quickly, we have to open up for questions. How can Malaysia formulate its big power policy towards the US and EU? I was just reading a simple case of fasteners, yeah, on apparels. It's coming through China into Malaysia and going to the US. So the US has tracked it that it comes from China and there are tariffs on Chinese fasteners that are exported. But because of this indirect flow, now Malaysia will get into the radar of this conflict between China and US. So how should we position ourselves?
Did you say the panels, the solar panels, or
fasteners?
Apparel.
Yeah.
Actually, solar panels too. You have Chinese investment that goes to Kedah or Penang, not to supply Malaysia, but actually to supply the rest of the world, to escape the tariffs imposed directly on China. It's an opportunity, but it's kind of a trade diversion. You are really not attracting because of other competitive factors. So what is up for Malaysia? So let me, I guess, conclude my views on the fact that 3 days ago we had the announcement of Nobel Prize winner two professors from MIT, one from Chicago, that at the time that they co-wrote most of the things, he was based at Harvard. So all from the Massachusetts area. And they emphasize the role of institutions, like domestic processes and institutions as the answer for long-term growth. When we get tomorrow to the budget, there will be a lot of discussions about tiny things. Oh my gosh, how many billions to investment A, B, or C, or the LRT3, or blah, 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 or tax discount for that and relief for that. The impact of that in the long term is zero. Zero. This is super non-important. It's going just to be noise. What Malaysian, in as a honorary Malaysian, as someone with a Malaysian heart, but the only thing that doesn't make me Malaysian is to not have a passport and not like durian. I would say that the most important thing, the legacy that the current generation power can leave to the future is actually institutional reforms to make that country attractive for Malaysians to stay, to build a thriving economy, to keep their talents in the country, not just try to attract FDI from the rest of the world, but actually really be innovative in Malaysia. And to achieve that, reforms related to dispersion of power, to transparency, to avoid preferential treatment in contracting, to make sure that you feel that you're doing business in an environment that the best offer is actually the one that's going to be valued and not through different political connections. That would be the Malaysian that would chart its own path, regardless of US, regardless of China, but one that Malaysians and honorary Malaysians would want to stay and build the economy of the future here. And that's not going to come from US or from China, but it will come from the domestic political process. And the work of the latest Nobel Prize winners is exactly about that.
Thank you, Professor. We'll take questions now from the floor. Okay, maybe I'll pose this to Mr. Woon. Yeah. What would be the most poisonous racun for Malaysia, for the Malaysian economy moving forward? Yeah. Maybe racun in the sense, not the risk per se, could be the uncertainties or some hidden agenda based on this geopolitical shifts that has not been fleshed out properly. Yeah.
I think rather than saying, maybe what I'm trying to say might not be exactly a racun, but it has been a thing for Malaysia for very long. I think just to emphasize again earlier about how Malaysia has many grand plans and many master plans, even from the YB Rafidi's speech earlier. He did mention that the government did roll out a lot of plans. I mean, if you look at all the plans, those are very good plans, and those are what is really necessary to actually push Malaysia forward. But I think to some extent, we have always fallen short of the execution. We have many grand plans in the past, but it didn't really bring us to where we would want to be, especially say if we talk about even for the E&E sector. He has been in Malaysia for so many years, but we have actually failed to actually move up the value chain. We are very good in the lower end of the manufacturing processes, but I think the key value or the key progress that we want to achieve is more on the front end, the IC chip designs, and also we do see, we are taking some comfort in the sense that I think there are sense of direction. The government or the policymakers are aware of where we need to head towards. That's why you do see the IC park design, the largest in Malaysia and all, being rolled out. But I think the key really comes down to execution up until we see, or until personally, if I see something concrete materializes, I wouldn't be, I guess, wouldn't sleep well at night.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Woon. Professor, there's one question for you directly. What's your take on Malaysia cozying up to Russia as part of its push for BRICS membership? Any potential conflicts on its stance of neutrality?
So I'm originally from Brazil. So the B over there stands for Brazil. I find BRICS to be meaningless. There's no benefit to be in that club. When it was the concept, when it was created by the O'Neill at Goldman Sachs, was a view of, oh, these countries will have all these characteristics, and by certain years in the future, they're going to be these huge powers. And then what was essentially a piece of opinion became encapsulated in an organization, which I don't see any benefit of being cozy to Russia. It's a country that has the GDP of Spain, aging society. It had fantastic universities and mathematics and all of that, but not to be used internally because there is a dictator in power. Stifle innovation and everything. There's absolutely no benefit. This is not a market that Russians want to be in Russia. You might want to play. There is a BRICS bank, which, by the way, run by the impeached president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. She tried to run as a senator for a state. She lost. And there was no place to put her. They sent to China. This is one of those things that if you accomplish this goal of being a BRICS member, how it's going to change the rakyat of Malaysia? I don't think it's going to change at all. Brazil is not better because BRICS exists. Or South Africa.
Thank you, Prof, for those views. I think joining multilateral agreements, it's more of a political game than an economic game. Yeah, it's a bandwagon effect. Ultimately, when one country joins, the others feel they should not be left out, but the games are not very clear, I guess. Now, there's one question on multilateral agreements. Maybe I can pose it to Dr. Oh. Are multilateral agreements merely a diplomatic stunt? Observed that countries tend to have more protectionism policy in place given the disparity among trading countries.
Well, if you look at the example of the European Economic Community, which evolved into the European Union, you have the opposite answer, right? I mean, though this multilateral free trade agreement could eventually bring the region closer together and thereby making it more peaceful and prosperous. But I think the key, again, is still various countries, whether after they very gleefully sign all these wonderful FTAs, do they actually have the determination, the political will, the domestic political will in order to implement these free trade agreements, to align their national legislations with their international commitments. I would like to go slightly back to the first question about Malaysia's I think one or two main challenges. I think there are several. Number one, I think we have resource curse because Malaysia is so bountiful with plenty of rains and sunshines, fertile soil, and so on. Sometimes, we tend to forget that indeed we need to work extra hard in order to compete with some of our less, shall we say, less fortunate neighbors and so on. And then there's this dependency mentality on various government subsidies, government programs, and so on. As I think the professor mentioned just now, everybody is gearing up for tomorrow's budget to see whether there are some goodies, tax reductions, subsidies, and so on for your particular industry or your particular household even. And I think internationally, well, sometimes we have to be more careful in some of our positioning. If there are events which are far, far away from us, perhaps we can pay less attention. When there are events which are impinging upon our territories, whether maritime or land, then we should pay more attention here.
Thank you, Dr. Oh. The next question is US-China tension and the latter's claim on South China Sea. Would it severely affect Malaysia and the region? How then can we take advantage of the situation to ensure economic stability? Any takers for this?
Well, this is a perennial question. we unlike the Philippines, we usually take a rather low-key approach when it comes to our, shall we say, quote unquote, engagements with China on contested territories on South China Sea. And only when these engagements became very serious and egregious, then sometimes we will make our protest notes known to the world at large. Because why? Because simply the trade volume with China is too huge for us to sort of put up a very strong and antagonistic position against them. The United States and a lot of Western countries, of course, emphasize on freedom of navigation, operations, and so on. And we agree with that. We think there should be freedom of navigations. But as long as the West do not engage with us substantially on the economic front, it's very difficult, frankly speaking, for us to put up a very strong positions vis-a-vis China.
Next question, wearing an economist hat, do you think the booming foreign data center investments in Malaysia have a real economic impact to the country?
Maybe I can take that since Ram mentioned by Julie earlier. We did recently concluded a intensive study on data centers. So definitely, I think there are a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, a lot of worries about how, being given that how energy intensive or resource intensive the data center industry is, would it actually bring about sufficient economic impact to the country? So I think definitely, if you look at just purely the direct impact, there is definitely direct impact. We do see a lot of the construction players, the property players, all have actually really enjoyed the first line benefits. Other than that, you also see players like your communication player, Telecom Malaysia, TNB, have all also enjoyed, I guess, quite a steady or expected improvement in terms of demand for their services and moving ahead. But however, I think the key benefit of what the country would like to enjoy will definitely come down to, at the end of the day, would it bring about a broad base or whole of nation kind of benefits towards the rest of the country? This will mostly come from indirect impact, and unfortunately or fortunately, most of it will actually come from be very dependent on building up the whole digital economy in Malaysia. I mean, I think coming back, you always see the same thing. I mean, we do have a very good blueprint. We have the My Digital economic blueprint in Malaysia that was published, and I think it has laid out quite a good plan into where we will see some of this contribution coming from data centers and flow into the rest of the economy. So I think the short answer is yes, direct yes, indirect, which is where we want to be aiming for. It depends. Economists like to say it depends, and this one really depends on whether we manage to build up our economy, capitalizing on all these new infrastructures and resources that we have at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Woon. Maybe a final question for Professor. Malaysia has been struggling to attract digital infrastructure investment since 2010. Despite our underpriced resources, the FDI only came in after the SG moratorium. Perhaps it's not about cost.
It's a little bit of so in 2019, right, that you came with Singapore moratorium. At the same time, you had the data nationalism that allowed more countries, even when not necessarily competitive, such as Indonesia, restrict that, oh, you have to keep the data inside these national boundaries, out of the NSA, data snooping scandal, and so on. Now you have a different kind of impetus for the growth of data centers, which is the huge growth in terms of AI. But why would you capture more than what would be the domestic share? Then that's related to what makes investing in this place more competitive than, say, Thailand or other places of ASEAN. There you have part of it is an infrastructure of landing cables, submarine cables, data cables, in everything else related to land acquisition, your ability to have developers, and particularly the price of electricity, and so on. So when we actually do look at those costs of resources, it's very clear that Malaysia is underpricing their resources, and that becomes one of the factors of attractiveness. My question to policymakers, and I was 2 days ago engaging a stakeholder discussion with MDEC, is unless you actually tie that growth with other objectives or developing the use of this infrastructure, just hosting it is not going to be a game changer. Just having a data center is not going to generate jobs. It's like an empty place that you just have to do maintenance. It's going to increase the demand for electricity. If you're able to tie that to new investments on green in the green sector, that's great. But you might just increase the usage of the reserve margin. So I think the future is yet to be decided. It's important to really think how to leverage from this opportunity.
Thank you. Before we call the session to a close, I think it would be nice to just get some final thoughts, 1 minute each, because Malaysia is going to assume the ASEAN chair next year. We spoke a bit about deepening regional integration. My concern is we have been talking about this for a long, long time, more than 2 decades, deepening economic integration within ASEAN. Intra-ASEAN trade has reached a plateau about 23%. It's not moved anywhere. And just as you mentioned, the regulatory distance is very high. Even to streamline product standards, they are unable to move beyond 22 standards for more than a decade. So what would be the role that Malaysia should focus on moving forward, facing geopolitics? What would be one critical role if you would want to tell the Prime Minister of Malaysia? What should he focus on to sort of showcase ASEAN?
Well, ASEAN is perhaps one of the most peaceful region in the world. Huh? We don't fight one another. So it's indeed time to make it more prosperous. And Malaysia could be an example for doing so. Number one, our own national legislation, we should bring it in line with ASEAN Economic Community, with ASEP, and so on. And then perhaps we could work with our like-minded ASEAN neighbors to encourage them to do the same. We can have more exchanges in terms of students, in terms of various other personnel among all these ASEAN countries. And only on that basis should we become more ambitious and try to have some sort of united stance in terms of ASEAN's foreign policy and so on. So first take care of our household, and then only then could we talk about ASEAN having united stand on some of the more pressing issues of the world. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think domestic reforms is a prerequisite. Mr. Woon, very quickly, 1 minute.
Yeah, very quickly, I think just to come back to the data center cost, we did cover that in the report as well. So feel free to read it later. But very quickly, I think I think in terms of how, we have major superpowers like US and China, that shows that strength actually comes in numbers, or strength comes in, I guess, money, I guess in this case. That's why I think the ASEAN cooperation does actually play a big role in terms of at least putting out Malaysia's voice or ASEAN voice as a whole on the global front. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Woon. Professor?
20 seconds. Vision for ASEAN to be the place for green investments and make sure that we multiply by a lot the ASEAN power grid so we can facilitate integration on the power sector throughout ASEAN.
Thank you. I enjoyed this session. I hope you all did the same. Can we show our appreciation to all 3 panelists?
Once again, thank you very much to our esteemed panelists, Professor Renato Lima, Mr. Woon Kai Jack, Dr. Ho, and Professor Dr. Evelyn. We also like to invite you to be up front for a photo opportunity. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, can the honey be the antidote to the venom, right? Boleh tak madu menjadi kata orang tu bagi pengobat bagi racun tadi, right? Very thought-provoking debate, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you give them once again a big round of applause for that outstanding debate and thoughts.